All right, ladies and gentlemen. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, harmonizing the gospel accounts. We were studying last week. Under the third time of leaving Herod's territory, it was letter H, the paying of tribute. Matthew chapter 17, verses 24 through 27. They were read last week, but we left off at verse 25, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly read them again and go over them this morning again with us. And when they were, and when they were come to Capernaum, they that received tribute money came to Peter and said, Doth not your master pay tribute? He saith, Yes. And when he was come into the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Peter saith unto him, Of strangers. Jesus saith unto him, Then are the children free. Notwithstanding, lest we should offend them, go thou to the sea, and cast an hook, and take up the fish that first cometh up, and when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. That take and give unto them for me and thee. All right, the paying of tribute. What again? One more time, we talked about this last week. What is the paying of tribute? What is tribute? Taxes, that's right. It is not my favorite thing in the world, but I am grateful that we do have some things good in this world that come from us paying our taxes. I am discouraged sometimes by some things our tax money goes to. But nonetheless, it is not wrong, and this helps us to understand it, to pay tribute. And I want to reemphasize, as I did last Sunday, the Roman Empire was not a righteous government. The Roman Empire was a very wicked government and did many things contrary to the will of God, and yet we still find that they were to pay taxes as citizens of the Roman Empire, or as residents of it. Their citizen was a different situation in regard to the way Rome looked at things. But nonetheless, back in verse 24, they come to Peter, the tax collectors do, or those that we would call publicans at times, and they wanted to know, doth not your master pay tribute? And he comes right out immediately and says yes. I mean, he doesn't hesitate. Yes, he pays tribute. And it goes on, and when he was coming to the house, Jesus prevented him, saying, What thinkest thou, Simon? He wants now to have the opportunity to teach. Our Lord did not miss an opportunity when it came upon him. If there was an opportunity for his disciples and those around him to learn a valuable lesson, he took it. And this was one of those times. The question that he gave him, What thinkest thou, Simon? Of whom do the kings of the earth take custom or tribute? Of their own children or of strangers? Well, the answer is right. Jesus saith unto him, Of strangers. The children don't have to pay the taxes if they are, in a sense, I guess you would say, the prince or something along those lines, or the princess or the king and the queen. They're not probably going to have to worry about this in regard to things the way that a stranger would. So then he says, Then are the children free. That's true. They didn't have to do it. And he's making the point here, who are really the children of the kingdom when you get right down to it ultimately? The followers of Christ are. Today, we are the children of the kingdom. Is that true? But we still have to exist in the physical world. And therein presents the issue. We are citizens of the United States of America, but we are also citizens of the kingdom of Christ. And with that being the case, we have to honor, if you will, our responsibilities to both. With that being said, there is a caveat, there is obviously an exception. We'll talk more about it in a moment. But here, back then, he's taking this opportunity to make that point. Even though the children are free, and even though ultimately they are going to be the ones who are free, notwithstanding, he said, lest we should offend them. Now, I want to make a point about offending people the way the Bible teaches it. Does this simply mean that it's just going to upset them? Well, yes, in a way it does. The idea of notwithstanding lest we should offend them does have the issue of whether or not they're going to be upset if they don't do it. But ultimately, if they don't do it, what are they going to think about the disciples? They're not following the law. They're not obedient to the law. And if that is the case, that they have that reputation amongst them, that's going to bring shame and reproach upon those who are followers of Christ. Today, when we find the idea of offending someone, many people think that it's simply about making them upset. To scripturally offend someone in Romans chapter 14, it means you have led them to sin. You have been the instrument behind them sinning. And that's what it means to scripturally offend someone today. Just making them mad is not always the issue at hand. Did Jesus make some people mad? Yes, he did. Very often he was in contradiction, not contradict, but in contrast to what the Pharisees and the scribes and the Sadducees were teaching. And therefore, they didn't like the fact of what he was saying. And they got upset with him. Did it stop him from saying what needed to be said? No. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that, ironically, in our sermon this morning when we talk about tolerance and intolerance. But here, go out there, he says, so we don't offend them, basically. Go thou to the sea and cast an hook and take up the fish that cometh up. Now, how many of you have been fishing and never caught a thing? Been there? Happens sometimes, doesn't it? How would you like to know that you were guaranteed you were going to catch something? Well, that's basically what he's finding out right here. You're going to the sea, you're going to cast an hook, and you're going to take up the fish that first cometh up. And when thou hast opened his mouth, thou shalt find a piece of money. Doesn't tell us exactly the denomination of the money or the value of the money, but it's going to be money, right? Now, I don't know about you, but I've caught things when I've been fishing that were inanimate objects. That you might have caught the old boot or a lounge chair, or somebody threw it into the lake or something like. You might end up catching something along those lines. But I don't know that I have ever caught a fish yet when I went to take the hook out of its mouth, there was some money in it. Now, if that happened every single time, I think I'd fish just about every single day. But no, this was a very special situation, wasn't it? How that got there is a matter of supposition. It does not tell us how it got there. But Jesus knew it was going to be there, and that's what matters. So when Peter takes it up, he does indeed find that piece of money, and he was to give it unto them, the publicans, the tax collectors, for me and thee. In other words, it was going to be a sufficient amount of money to pay the tribute that these people were collecting. Now, we've talked about taxes for us. We've talked about how that we are citizens of the United States government as well as kingdom or citizens of the kingdom of Christ, and how we are to be observant to the rules and regulations thereof of both. Open with me to Romans 13. There is a limitation to how far we are to be obedient to the civil government. Romans 13, beginning at verse 1, let every soul be subject unto the higher powers. In this context of Romans 13, the higher powers here is not a reference to heaven and God. And it's going to be shown as we go down through here. This is a reference to government here on earth. Be subject unto the higher powers. For there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God. Ultimately, at the end of the day, civil government exists on this earth because God ordained it. He wanted man not to be in anarchy. We need to understand that too, because we are seeing people today pushing as much as they possibly can to get away from the rule of law, and friends, that's contrary to the design and ordination of God. God expects us to have civil government, and that we are subject to them with limitation. And I'll make that point again in a moment. He goes on to say, whosoever therefore resisteth the power. In the context, was he talking about? Civil government. Whosoever therefore resisteth the power, resisteth the ordinance of God. Now here's the way that we can look at that. If the law of the land says that we are to obey something, and we refuse to obey it, generally, I'm going to add that to it because there's still an exception I'm going to get to. Generally, if we will not obey it, we are violating this verse. And friends, if we violate a verse of God, what is that? That is sin, 1 John 3:4. If we refuse to be subject unto the higher powers and we resist the power thereof, generally, and I'll make the caveat again in a moment, just be patient with me. Generally, we are resisting the ordinance of God, and therefore we are sinning in His sight. I'll give you, for instance, the issue of taxes. We've already shown that Jesus said that it was right to do it, right? Showed us it was right to do it. What if April 15th comes by and we say, you know what, I'm a Christian, I'm a citizen of the kingdom of Christ, and I will not pay these taxes because I know these taxes are going to go to things I don't agree with. They're going to fund things that I don't believe Christians ought to be a part of. So I refuse to pay taxes. Is he right to do that? Not in this case, no. He would be sinning in the sight of God. Why? Because it is right to pay tribute. I asked you earlier about the Roman Empire. Were they a righteous government? Absolutely not. But Jesus still said, pay tribute. When the tribute money or the tax money gets into the hands of the civil government, they are the stewards of it then. And if they misuse it contrary to God's law, they will be accountable for it. Remember, the powers that be are ordained of God. They have that power because God gives it to them. And if they misuse that power, guess what? They're going to be accountable for it. Now, and they that resist, notice, shall receive to themselves damnation. We don't obey by the laws of the land, generally speaking. We resist the ordinance of God. We bring upon ourselves condemnation. We will be lost for it. It is not a joke, friends. There are some people who make light of things like this, who think that it is a trivial matter to do things contrary to the laws of the land. It is not a trivial matter. It is a matter of salvation of our souls, one way or the other. If we will not respect and obey, generally speaking, the laws of the land, we will lose our souls for it. That's what it says right there. We will receive damnation. Now, how many times have you ever witnessed someone very flippantly, very casually break the laws of the land and act like it's no big deal? Now, let me say this to you. There are some laws I think are silly sometimes. I do. Generally speaking, I think they're kind of silly in nature. But you know what? I'm still to obey them. There are some that if I were doing it, I would do it differently. Guess what? I still am to obey them. Because if I don't, I'm resisting the ordinance of God, I am resisting the power of God, and I am going to receive to myself damnation. It's that serious, friends. It's not a joke. It's not trivial. Now, he goes on and says, for rulers are not a terror to, notice, good works, right? There's a difference between good works and bad works. Good works are those that are right to do, correct? Let me give you for instance. Generally speaking, in almost every nation, is it wrong to murder? Generally, most of them will say yes. Now, there are some that say it's not murder, but yes, generally speaking, right? Murder's wrong. If you resist the power and say, I don't care, this person did me wrong, I'm going to take his or her life and I'm going to do it anyway, well, rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. You've done an evil work. Guess what now? You're in trouble. If you do that which is good, generally, you're not going to have a problem with the civil government. How many of you have the civil government knocking on your door every single day telling you that you're doing something wrong when you obey the law of the land? Are they doing that to you all the time? Are they constantly hounding you because you're doing that which is right? I get so upset with some of this I see on TV and things nowadays about our police forces and things of that nature. And are there times where they've done wrong? Yes, absolutely. They're human beings. They make mistakes. But friends, the ultimate amount of time that they are out there serving, they're not going after the people that are doing things right. They're going after the people that are doing things wrong. That's what it makes point of here. They're not terrors to those who do good works, but to the evil. Wilt thou then not be afraid of the power? You should be. They have the power in their hands to punish you. That's the point. Do that which is good. Obey the laws of the land. Do that which is right in the sight of God, and thou shalt have praise of the same. Generally, like I said, you're doing that which is right. They're not going to hound you. They're glad and grateful for you. They consider you a good citizen, right? For he, the powers that be, the higher powers, government, civil government, for he is the minister or servant of God to thee for good. Anarchy is not what God wants. Civil government is in place for our good. Friends, I'm grateful that there are people who are willing to serve to keep things generally peaceful as much as they can. How about you? Do you want anarchy? Do you want people literally to take anything they want from you without any repercussions whatsoever? Do you want them to be able to go out and take the life of someone just because on a whim they wanted to do it and not have any repercussions for what they know? But, now remember, he's not a terror to good works but to evil. He's the minister, the servant of God. We never need to forget that. He is a servant of God in this capacity. He is a servant of God doing this. But if thou do that which is evil, if you make the choice to go against the laws of the land, against the will of God, be afraid. For he, civil government, beareth not the sword in vain. Friend, what was a sword's purpose when this was written in the 1st century A.D.? Death. These people who claim to be Christians, who say that Jesus would be against the death penalty, do not know what they're teaching. Friend, my Lord was executed, and he didn't stop it. If he was against the death penalty, guess what? That would have been a great time to speak up against it, wouldn't it? And he was innocent. That's usually the argument. Well, what if they're innocent? You kill an innocent man. That doesn't mean you throw away the rule of law. That doesn't mean you throw it into anarchy. That doesn't mean that civil government's wrong in and of itself. He is the minister or servant of God for good, and if you do that which is evil, be afraid, because he beareth not the sword in vain. He has the right by God to execute punishment on you. And God expects it to be done. One cannot go back and study the old law and see that God does not expect the capital punishment to be implemented at times. Israel was absolutely commanded to do it at times. And when they didn't do it, they violated God. Friends, I love the soul of every human being. And I wish every soul on death row would repent and obey the gospel before they go to judgment. But the fact that they have done those sins and those crimes here on this earth means they are accountable for the actions they have committed. And if they have to be punished even by death, then so be it. The soul can be saved if the body is still destroyed. That's what matters. He is, again, a servant of God. Now, he says it again, for he is the minister or servant of God. He has the right to do this because he's serving God in this capacity. God gave him the power to do it. A revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. You do that which is wrong, God's given civil government the authority to do something about it. The problem we have today is many people don't want people doing anything about it. How many feel like you're in bizarro world sometimes here lately? It's gotten to, and the Bible talks about it, and it's true. It's gotten to the point, friends, where people are calling evil good and good evil. And I'm not talking about just a little bit. I'm talking about by widespread notions. Now, verse 5, wherefore ye must needs be subject. Again, subject to what? The higher power, civil government. Ye must needs be subject, not only for wrath, not only because he can execute wrath upon you if you do wrong. Don't just be obedient because of that, but also for conscience sake. It's the right thing to do. You know, if you're violating the law, you're violating God's will. Don't just do it because he's going to punish you if you do wrong. Do it for your conscience sake because you know you're serving God faithfully. When you obey, you're serving the servant of God faithfully. And look what was the next thing is out of his mouth, or I guess out of his pen here in Romans 13:6. For this cause pay ye tribute also. Why? For conscience sake and because it's the law of the land. And if you don't, you can be punished for it. Pay ye tribute also, for they, the higher powers, are God's ministers. That's the third time in 2 verses that we find it, verse 4 and verse 6, that he's referred to him as a minister or ministers of God, a servant of God. He's already been shown that the higher powers are ordained of God, verse 1. For they are God's ministers, attending continually upon this very thing. Render, therefore, to all their dues. Wait a minute. You know I stand up here and I'm going to be grumpy for a minute. When I moved to Georgia, guess what I had to do? I had to start paying a state income tax. I didn't have to do that in Tennessee. I had to pay a state income tax when I came to Georgia. I'd already done it when I purchased in Alabama before. It's not something brand new for me. But in Tennessee, there is no state income tax. With that being the case, when I came to Georgia, guess what I was supposed to do? Not only pay my federal taxes now, but your Georgia taxes too. Render, therefore, to all. If it's state government, if it's federal government, if that's the law of the land, render, therefore, to all their dues. I know I haven't given the I'm going to. Custom or tribute to whom tribute is due, custom to whom custom, fear to whom fear, honor to whom honor. Owe no man anything but to love one another, for he that loveth another hath fulfilled the law. Is that hard to understand, really, friends? Really, is it that hard to understand? Not really. Now, here's the caveat. Here's the exception. When the civil government tells us that we must do something that causes us to violate the law of God, that is when we are not to be obedient to the higher powers. That is not because we want to be rabble-rousers. That is not because we are trying to stir things up to cause revolution. It is because, first and foremost, God and His will above everything. There is order to things. The higher powers ordained of God? Absolutely. Our servants are ministers of God? Absolutely. Should we obey them? Yes, except for when they tell us we are commanded to violate our God and His law. When they tell us that, we are to be faithful to God, no matter what. Remember, no matter how many times the civil government makes laws that are contrary to the will of God, we ought to obey God rather than men. Acts 5, is it 29? It's either 5 or 29 or 39. It's 29. Scott's doing it. 29. Acts 5, 29. Any questions on that? If the law of the land today said that we are required, and notice I'm going to make it outrageous, I am, so just bear with me. If the law of the land said it is required because our population is getting so large that every citizen under the age of 30 years old was to be killed, and that we are responsible for taking the life of at least one ourselves, will we obey it? Absolutely not. Why? Because it violates God and His law. At that moment in time, we don't obey the laws of the land. Up until that point, we should be obedient to every law of the land that does not violate the law of God. No matter how silly we think it is, no matter how much we dislike it, no matter how much we would do differently, if it does not violate the law of God, we are to be subject not only for wrath, but for conscience sake. Go over to 1 Peter for a moment, chapter 2. Someone read for us there, beginning at verse 12. Actually, back up to verse 11. Begin at 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 11. And if you will, please read down through verse 17. Hang on just a moment, Shelby. Take a look at that carefully. Did you notice that? Have your conversation. That's your manner of life. That's the way you live every day. Honest among the Gentiles. We were to be subject not only for wrath's sake, but for what? Conscience sake. Have a good, clean conscience. We're doing that which is right and honest, correct? That whereas they speak against you as evildoers, now, again, are there people out there that think Christians are awful, that Christians need to stop doing what they're doing, and they talk bad about us? Do they do that? Yes. They may speak of you against you as evildoers. They may by your good works, they see that you're doing that which is right no matter what, which they shall behold, glorify God in the day of visitation. We're supposed to be obedient to the laws of the land as long as they don't violate God's law for them. There's another reason we're to be obedient, so that those who are out there in the world will see the obedient ones doing the right thing, and God will be glorified by it. You ever thought of it from that point of view? That's how important it is. And if you think for a moment the world's not watching you every single day and the things you do, they are. Let me give you, for instance, you're at the office, and there is a supply room. And in that supply room are things that, I think I could use that at the house. Tell you what, when 5 o'clock rolls around, everybody gets out of here, I may stay about 15 minutes late, and I'll see if I can't put that in my trunk of my car. See the point I'm trying to make? What if somebody's still there at 5:15 and sees you haul that out of there? You've just lost your influence for good in that person's life. And they're not going to glorify God because of what you've done. Ultimately, if they don't see you're still wrong. All right, keep reading. For the what of evildoers? What? You mean that's what's... It doesn't say rehabilitation. It says punishment. By the way, I'm not totally against rehabilitation if it can be done, but punishment is what it's supposed to be about. Go ahead.
For so it is the will of God that with well-doing you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men, as free, not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness, but as the servants of God. Honor all men, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king.
All right, back up to verse 13 with us. Thank you, Shelley, for reading. I know I can interrupt her. She's used to it. Submit yourselves to every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake. It does not say submit to the ones you like or the ones you agree with. It says submit to every ordinance of man. Of course, we've already said there's that caveat, Acts 5:29, we are to obey God rather than men. If man tells us to do something that violates God's law, we don't obey that. If it doesn't, we are to obey every single one of them. Friends, I can't and some people say, well, you're being a little strict there. That's what it says, friend. Every ordinance says, it means every, or it doesn't say 95% of them and I can do the other 5% and leave them. That's not what it says. We are people who believe the book, correct? Yes, we believe the book. Are we to follow the book? That's what the book says. And here's why, for the Lord's sake. You want to know the best example of somebody who obeyed the laws of the land and when he was alive? Go back to the Christ. He could have called down legions of angels to stop his execution. He didn't do it. He could have stopped all the things that that were happening. He didn't do it. They were doing what they thought was right. They were doing what they thought was just. They weren't. But he didn't stop it, did he? He didn't stop the process, did he? Now, by the way, his trial, if you want to call it, that was a sham, but that's another story for another time. Do it for the Lord's sake, whether it be to the king as supreme, or unto governors as unto them that are sent by him for the punishment of evildoers. And I want to emphasize that again. That's what his job is, to punish the evildoers. He's supposed to be there for those who are doing good to be protected and praised, those who are doing wrong to be punished. That's not hard to understand. And for the praise of them that do well, which I just mentioned. It doesn't matter what level of government it is. If it doesn't violate the law of God, we're subject to it. If we're subject unto it, it's a law of our land, we're to obey it. By the way, king's supreme, right? Governor would be under him. That'd be almost like a state, wouldn't it? Which was the way we do it today. We also have city governments and county. We're supposed to be obedient. For so is the will of God. Friends, read that carefully and please take it to heart. This is the will of God. Yes, ma'am. Sure, go ahead.
Therefore be subject to every human creation because of the Lord, whether to the king as superior being superior to you, or to the governors as they are sent through him for vengeance on the evildoers and praise to the doers of good.
And that echoes what's in Romans 13. The ones who are to punish the evildoers are the revenger of wrath. They bring wrath upon them. Yes, sir. Or yes, ma'am. Absolutely. This is God's will, verse 15. And here, notice this. For so is the will of God that with well-doing. Well, in the context, what is the well-doing here? Obeying the ordinance of man. Following the laws of the land. They're not violating God's law. With well-doing, here's what we're going to do. You may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. I was working with a gentleman at one time, and we were sent out to do a job. And I'm not going to go over what it was that I did that he didn't, and it's not for me to be praised. I'm just using it because I thought of it as an example. We went out to do that job. I chose to obey the law on an occasion when he thought it was silly. He did. But you know what he came away from? And he said something similar to this, if I remember correctly. I cannot remember how he worded it, but I mean, he looked at me as someone who took it serious. You ain't playing around. It made him see this was legit. This was not somebody putting on a show. This man's living it. It wasn't me trying to do it for that purpose alone. I was doing it because I felt it was the right thing to do, obedient to God, obedient to the laws of the land. But look at what that man saw. Look at the impact it had on him. With well-doing, you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. Later on in that same... I say later on, I think it was later on at that same place of business, I was asked to do something else to violate the law by the company, and I refused. They gave me the lowest rung you could possibly give on the ladder for a part of that day to go out there and do a certain job. It was humbling. It was one of those things that made you have a big sinking feeling in your gut, but I knew I did right. At the end of the day, they couldn't fire me over it. I knew they couldn't fire me over it because they were wanting me to do something wrong. They'd have been in a lot of trouble. And it wasn't that I was trying to show them up, but I was not going, even if they fired me, I was not going to violate the ordinance of man because they told me to. I wasn't going to do it. God first. Laws of the land, right there, as long as they don't violate God's law. As free and not using your liberty for a cloak of maliciousness. Don't misuse this liberty you have, but as the servants of God. Honor all men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Honor the king. It's not that hard. It really isn't. You know what makes it hard? We do. By our thoughts and our feelings. And they're going to think funny of me, or they're going to make fun of me, or they're going to think I'm silly. Let them think what they want to think. You know who's happy with you? And that's what matters. Someone read Matthew. Oh, go ahead.
Also, with Jesus in the garden of Peter, makes it clear that we don't take the law into our own hands.
That's right, too. That's a good point. Jerry makes a very good point there. That we're not, Peter in the garden, when he wanted to cut off, or he did cut off Malchus's right ear, Jesus made it clear that that wasn't the way to handle things. We don't take the law into our own hands. That's exactly right. It's not supposed to be anarchy, nor is it supposed to be vigilantism. That's not the idea of what God wants. Law is the way God wanted it to be. Which, by the way, when you go back and you study, under the patriarchal age, they had a law God gave them to obey. Was that true? Mosaic age, God gave Israel a law that they were to obey. Is that true? Christian age, Christ gave a law that man's to obey. Is that true? I think God has an affection for law. Now, Matthew 22. You might be wondering why I hadn't gone there yet. Here we go. Let's go over to Matthew 22. I know we're getting ahead of ourselves. I understand that because we'll study this later on again when we come to it. But we're going to read starting at verse 17. Read with me. Tell us, therefore, what thinkest thou? Is it lawful to give tribute unto Caesar or not? Now, Caesar was not always the most righteous man in the world. He didn't do everything the way a Christian would want it done, or even a disciple at this point before the church was established. But Jesus perceived their wickedness. He knew what they were up to. And said, Why tempt ye me, ye hypocrites? Show me the tribute money. We'd pull out a bill, or we'd pull out a coin, and we'd hand it out there, and they brought unto him a penny. Wouldn't that be nice if that's all you had to pay? And he saith unto them, Whose is this image and superscription? What is that? The picture on the coin here. Who is this of? They say unto him, Caesar's. Then saith he unto them, Render therefore unto Caesar the things which are Caesar's, and unto God the things that are God's. That's how simple it is. There's nothing right about cheating on our taxes. There's nothing right about violating laws flippantly, even if we don't like them or don't agree with them. And friends, at the end of the day, I'm all for saving every dollar I can when tax money comes, in a way. Don't get me wrong. But it needs to be righteously done and not unrighteously. The less I pay, hey, makes my smile get a little bigger. But if I have to pay it, I'm going to. By the way, how many of you are familiar with the way that taxes are done with a preacher? Any of y'all familiar with that? Some of you might know this because you've done it before. Or as elders, you might have understood that it's different for preachers than it is for just somebody working at a factory somewhere. Now, I'm not saying that because I want to change, that I won't want to preach. I do. But did you know they consider me self-employed? Even though I'm located as a preacher here regularly and normally, they consider me self-employed. You know what that means, don't you? That means I have to pay self-employment tax. And that ain't no fun. Not at all. Yeah, it's not a fun thing. But that's the law. And we pay it. Now, any questions on this at all? Yes, sir. Go right ahead. The Lord is a man of war. Exodus 17:3. God commanded at many times under the old law that Israel go to war. there are times where war is necessary, unfortunately, because of evildoers. And with that being the case, at that moment in time, we are serving as ministers, or under the ministers of God, trying to protect those innocent and punish those who are evil. So with that being the case, I don't believe that it is wrong to serve in the armed forces. I don't believe it's wrong, if necessary, if you're fighting under the evildoers, to kill at that moment if necessary, because you're serving as that minister at that moment. You are, if you will, that minister at that moment in that position, because you're the executor of the wrath. But I will say this, it should not be something that people try to misuse either and say, well, like earlier with taking the law in our own hands, well, this man's done evil, I ought to be able to kill him. Well, we don't just have the free will to go out there and just do that. There are orders the way it needs to be done. Maybe this will help too, and some people struggle with this sometimes. If Roman law said that execution was allowed, and today, if execution were allowed today, could it be right? Somebody, if it's lethal injection, somebody has to push the button to make the poison go into the body, right? If it's the electric chair, somebody has to flip the switch to make it go on, correct? If it's a shooting or a what am I trying to say? Yeah, but firing squad. I couldn't get the word out. Thank you. Somebody has to pull the trigger of the gun. Could I do that? Yes, I could. Because at that moment in time, I am part of that government process who is a servant of God executing wrath upon the evildoer. So I hope that helps. Obviously, if we don't have to be in positions like that, we hope not to. But if we don't have those things where we can have people protect others, then it would be anarchy, and again, that wouldn't work. So again, keep in mind, God is not for war all the time just for the sake of war. That's not what I'm saying at all. But if it is necessary and good, sometimes we have to do that. Unfortunately, there are some people who will not change just by diplomatic ways, who will not do that which is right just by talking to them. Sometimes you need a firmer hand. And even sometimes Christians may be put in those positions too. Yes, sir.
Sometimes those who squabble over those who aren't paying enough taxes, they need to look at themselves a little deeper in the mirror every morning, because sometimes they're the ones that aren't doing the fair justice.
Oh, there are some that misuse. Oh, sure. There are some who will take advantage of certain things, whether it's scrupulous or unscrupulous, whether it's legal or illegal. Some of them will, if they can get away with it. It happens. Anything else? Hope you enjoyed the class. Hope it was profitable. I know we didn't go very far, but we covered a lot of ground. Thank you for your time.